The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to High Impact Family Engagement. Thank you for joining us. I'm Judy Carson and I am the Program Manager for School Family Community Partnerships at the Connecticut State Department of Education. Thank you for making time to join us today. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and what role you play in your school or community. We'll also be taking your questions, and there's a place for that. We will have a Q&A session at the end. But as we're going through today's webinar, if you have questions, please put those in there, and we will answer your questions as we go. Today we're talking about how to make families feel welcome partners in the school and how to communicate that family engagement is a core value. Last month we talked about the research background behind family engagement, and we identified key high-impact practices, those practices that truly engage parents as partners in their children's education and have an impact on student achievement. Ann Henderson was our guest on the webinar, and we shared some terrific resources. This month, we're digging into one of those high-impact practices, and that's creating welcoming schools. We'll talk about the characteristics of a school that shouts welcome to families. We're also going to examine what feeling welcomed really feels like from a parent's perspective, and we'll give some tips and resources for things you can do right away. But first, let's just define what we mean by family engagement. The State Department of Education, along with the Office of Early Childhood Education and the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, have been conducting an extensive project to define family engagement in Connecticut. After a number of focus groups with professionals and parents, the language you're seeing on the screen is what came out to us loud and clear. We're talking about full, equal, and equitable partnerships. With this definition, we need to ask questions like, who are our partnership activities reaching, and who does not have equal access to being an active partner in our schools? Our topic today is foundational to creating this type of partnership. Without feeling welcomed or wanted, it's not possible to have a productive partnership, certainly not one that is full, equal, and equitable. And if only some parents experience a feeling that the school is welcoming, we haven't yet achieved our goal of equity for all families and students. The research backs this up. When we look at why parents get involved, we find that a welcoming environment is key. More than just a nice facility, feeling welcome also includes trust as well as positive interactions. Letting parents know in many different ways that they are wanted and valued as partners is the foundation for working together to support students. Without this foundation, a school family partnership program will never take root. It's all about the relationship, and a relationship can't form where one party does not feel valued, wanted, or trusted. I'm thrilled to be here today with Betsy Laborious and Gerald Barrett from CREC. They're joining me to talk about how we can create more welcoming schools. Under Betsy's leadership, CREC has been doing this work for over a decade, training and coaching schools to become more welcoming to families. I want to just take a moment and let you know where this project started. This was more than 10 years ago. Our deputy commissioner at the time was George Coleman, and some of our listeners might know George. He, very elegant man, always very well dressed. He was on a vacation day, dressed casually, and he stopped into a school to visit with the principal. George, being the deputy commissioner, was very accustomed to being recognized immediately when he walked into a room. Well, he walked into the office of the school, and he was not recognized. He was not addressed at all. He decided to take this moment to just conduct a little observation, and he watched the clock. And to hear George tell the story, it was almost 17 minutes before some of the staff in the office acknowledged him and asked him how they could be of help. So George took this lesson and brought it back to the Department of Education, and he said, we need to do something. When parents or any community member walks into a school, we need to be sure they're acknowledged immediately. But even more than that, there's many different ways that our schools acknowledge, recognize, and tell our families and community members that they're valued and we're glad that they're there. So this project grew out of George's experience and his leadership, knowing that all schools make a difference when they let families know that they're glad to see them. So Betsy and Gerald are going to take us through some information about how schools become more welcoming or not so welcoming. They're going to share a bit more about the research, and then finally some ideas for getting started. Thank you for being here, Betsy.
Thank you, Dr. Carson, Judy, for the invitation to be part of this webinar series on high-impact family engagement. We are going to present information on the welcoming school work that we've done over the past 10 years. So we have some insight, and the way we started and where we're landing now has given us greater opportunity to really look at schools, as Judy said, and that whole idea of family engagement. So the plan today is to review the why, really present the what, and then talk a little bit about the so what. Why would this make a difference? So again, Judy, thank you for giving us the, the kind of context and the impetus for the work that was started, again, some 10 years ago. We identified a gap and that there was a need to really examine how inviting or how welcomed parents actually felt as they entered the school. And our impression was what was parents' first impression. So welcoming schools really was developed as a family engagement practice. The goals are to connect families and schools as partners to celebrate diversity and examine equity through a welcoming lens to promote student success. And what I want to pay special attention to is that welcoming lens and also student success. So the work that, while we're looking at welcoming and inviting and that invitation to the school, know that the ultimate goal is for students to be successful as citizens in the future. So equity really has many different meanings, but the bottom line and the question that we should be asking, as Judy stated before, are all families being treated fairly? May they be treated different because of the way they look, they talk? What about their economic status? We needed to know what was happening. Our first response was really to think about customer service. So we called stores like Nordstrom's, we called banks, we called other businesses, and we gathered information. But one of the things that we knew is that we needed more information and better research to lay the foundation for the work. So our first piece that we really looked at was the work of Catherine Hoover Dempsey. And she talked a lot about school invitingness. And the three constructs that she talked about were a sense of efficacy, an understanding of parents and their role as parents, but finally, that invitation from the school. And so that invitingness that we talk about. And guess what? When we looked at why parents get involved and what she looked at as in terms of why parents got involved, school invitingness was the actually biggest bang, so to speak, for the buck in terms of the first step toward engaging parents. And again, you can see for student success. The question really is, what happens when I come into school? How is it inviting? Or what happens even when I'm reading a memo or a newsletter? Is that something that's parent friendly as well? So we're talking about that first impression as we enter the school, but know as we begin to look at components that there are other aspects to this invitingness that we'll also be examining. Guess what we also did? We polled our parents, and the question that we asked them was, What makes you feel welcomed at your school? And of course, parents went right to the heart of the question. What they talked about was, when I went into the school, people looked me in the eye. They were prepared for me. They actually knew my name. They made me feel safe. And it was a genuine, positive greeting. People really, again, understood and wanted me to be there. Finally, we went to the Bible on Family Engagement, Beyond the Bake Sale. Thank you, Dr. Mapp and Ann Henderson. We actually looked at the very first edition of Beyond the Bake Sale. And in her work, Dr. Mapp really went, again, polled parents and developed a model called the joining process. And the joining process, as you can see, talks about welcoming, honoring, and connecting families. Okay, so what we know, right, about family engagement practice is that it's relational. It's about building relationships, and that is the work that we are kind of connecting with on an ongoing basis. There are, what I want to point out, we're going to talk a little bit about what this tool, the specificity of the Connecticut model. So there are many wonderful tools, and out there in assessments and surveys. But what we thought in Connecticut is that if we're talking about equity, and if we're talking about opportunities for schools and families to work together, we needed to create the conditions for that to happen. And so our welcoming school model is, it's a project of attraction. In other words, it's not that you necessarily have to agree with everything in the model, but that you're open to understanding, and reflection, and that schools and families choose to work together. It's an internal assessment tool so that it's used by the school district and district personnel. It's not something that's coming from the outside, so it's an internal process. And probably most important, or two most important pieces are that a team is developed, a welcoming team is developed that's representative of families, the school, and the community. And I would say that this is a non-negotiable. When Gerald and I present, statewide, one of the things that we talk to staff about is that, if you plan on doing the welcoming walkthrough, make sure that families are involved. And then I would even recommend you might want to look at families that have not typically been involved or engaged in the school. Now, why would you want to do that? The reason that you would do that is because different perspectives, people have different perspectives, certainly, on what they're seeing, what they're observing, or written kinds of materials. It's important to understand each other's perspective. That is really kind of that process of reflection and hearing what people are saying. And finally, there's equal voice. So the team that's constructed, again, all people that are at the table have equal voice in terms of what their perceptions are and what their recommendations may be. Teams work together, they come to consensus, and they develop recommendations or strategies for action. What I do know is that this process is incredibly important. It does speak to the whole equity issue, and it builds social capital. So trust is being built in the school for additional kinds of efforts in terms of engagement. I just want to go over what a welcoming school. So we try to be clear about what it is and what it is not. So it is training or professional development. It's an opportunity to talk about the welcoming initiative, but also to help others understand family engagement as a larger practice. There are services to support or coaching to support the evaluation of the invitingness of your school. It is a constructive process. In other words, when we talk about constructive, it's built on a strength-based model. It's transparent. So there is the initial piece of kind of talking about this is really to let schools know, we're going to enter this process. We're going to let you know what will be happening. We're going to get back to you about some recommendations. And I'll give you an example. A lot of times we talk about the secret shopper. And the secret shopper, if you know about a secret shopper in business world, kind of goes in undercover, right, and tries to point out or identify deficits. Our process, again, does not, we're looking at a constructive process. In other words, we're being proactive. And in cases when we're beginning to do this, we really point out what's going right in the school and recommendations for action. We think it's a comprehensive process involving, surveys. There may be other surveys, a report, and most importantly, follow-up observation or survey to determine outcomes. So it's not an evaluation of teachers in a classroom. It does not observe classroom teaching or pedagogy, and it is not a tool used by outside evaluators. What I'd like to do is I'm going to hand over the next piece. Gerald Baird is really going to talk a little bit about the components and the nuts and bolts of what happens in terms of the welcoming walkthrough in Connecticut.
Great, thank you, Betsy. So there are 4 main components when we consider our welcoming tool in Connecticut, and that is the physical environment, school-wide practices and policies, welcoming school staff, and written as well as website materials. And if you haven't had the opportunity or taken the opportunity already to think about this question, I just want you to think about, ask yourself this question. How welcoming is your school or a school that you have in mind? When we think about how welcoming our schools are, we need to consider every point of contact that schools have with our families. This includes everything from parking to signage, how you're treated when you enter the school, how you receive information, and every other point of contact. When thinking about, as Betsy mentioned, who will be, part of this team to observe these different components, this again is really an opportunity to use an equity lens, and you really want to make sure that your teams are comprised of the diverse population within your school. So the way that our tool specifically works is that we actually encourage schools to develop teams, and each team takes on one specific component area. So there'll be between 3 to 5 individuals on a team, again comprised of staff in the school, community members, as well as parents, which is probably the most important piece. And they will then from there be charged with looking at that specific area. I want to highlight one component area in particular because it's a little bit different from the others, and that's school-wide practices and policies. Because rather than observing, this team actually sits down to interview the principal and ask these questions around school policies. And we'll take a look in a moment at some of these questions in particular. But what's interesting about the interviewing the principal is that it actually gives these individuals the opportunity to ask these questions, react, and give feedback based on their perception of how these policies impact them. I just want to share a quick story because we recently were helping a school in Connecticut facilitate a walkthrough. And what was interesting around this particular component area was that as the team interviewed the principal shared that there was in fact a policy around frequent communication between staff and families, and that the staff was, the policy specifically was around frequent contact to report something positive about the student. What was interesting is that there was a parent who was a parent of a middle school student, and there was also a parent of an elementary school student, and their experiences were drastically different. The elementary school parents said, yes, absolutely. I often hear from my child's teacher, and they're oftentimes reporting something positive. Middle school parent rarely heard from the staff member. So again, this just highlights the reason why we ask these questions, right? And that it's all about perception, and that there may be a policy in place, but one individual's perception varies drastically differently from another individual's perception. In terms of the process, we mentioned that there are many areas that make this tool unique, but one major area is in terms of setting the stage, and that's transparency. Oftentimes, as Betsy mentioned, right, this is not meant to be a gotcha. We get the question often, well, if we let everybody know that we're coming in to evaluate or look at how welcoming the school is, everybody's going to change their practice. But we know that while, you know, some may be able to change some things in a minor way, really that's just not possible. And moreover, we really need to make sure that we are transparent, and this gives us the opportunity to not only share what we will be embarking on through the initiative, but also let the larger school community know about the fact that you'll be sharing the outcomes and what you plan to do as a result of the good work being done through this initiative. In terms of the day of the walkthrough, this is really when everything happens and the rubber really meets the road. The teams come together, they go out and they complete their observation, and then they come back to do a debrief. And we find that really this debrief is oftentimes really the most important piece. One thing that Betsy will talk a little bit more about, and we often hear when we talk with folks after, is that really the process is oftentimes more important than the product. This opportunity to come together, to share what you observed, to share how it impacts you as an individual, really is one of the greatest values and assets of this tool. And in terms of the follow-up, this is really the you know, next important piece, because we need to make sure that once all of these areas of strength are highlighted and recommendations are made, that we need to assemble an action plan. And this action plan needs to be tied to our school improvement goals, ideally. And we really need to take the opportunity, and we can't stress this enough, that, you know, through this process, you are able to engage a group of parents and community members that really wanted to affect change in the school and the overall school community. You need to take advantage of this group, and whether it's assembling them as an action team, bringing them back together again to review some of the goals and action items that you assembled. Whatever the case may be, you need to take advantage of these folks and use them as partners in this process. And I don't know if Betsy or Judy have anything to add in terms of follow-up.
Well, I have a question
Sure.
for you all. So I was interested, you're talking about the team and the importance of gathering people together who have different perspectives. And one of the groups that we want to be sure is part of the process are community members. Can you talk about some examples of schools that have done innovative things, and who are the community members that they've been reaching out to?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the groups, a school that we recently worked with, was actually a technical high school in our state. And one of the important features of technical high schools is that they really want to establish a connection with businesses, especially for internships and jobs aligned with the school curriculum. So it was really important to the school that when they thought about community members, that they really were very specific and proactive about going out and seeking business leaders, individuals that own carpentry businesses, plumbers, electricians, so that they were really, again, able to, you know, underpin this connection to the community and how important it was for the overall school, and to get their feedback from these folks.
I'm just going to add a little bit as well, Gerald, because this is an area that I think is really important. So who do you have in your school? If there are community-based organizations such as After School, if there's a family resource center in your school and staff, you may have a youth resource officer in the school. These are all excellent people to have on the team. Now, if you're really brave, and we've done this in the past, some people have done this, they've also invited school board members to go through a walkthrough. And that may be a little bit of a political move, but I also think, honestly, you know, we need to start really kind of talking about our public schools right now as excellent resources for educational services and also additional resources. That happens when people from the outside begin to understand what schools really do, and they become advocates for programs and advocates for budgets. These are important issues as we look at the bigger picture.
Another group I'm thinking about are faith leaders.
Yes.
You know, those are incredibly important community members in many areas, and they have access to families
Absolutely.
outside of school. Usually schools don't. So it sounds like a lot of thought needs to be given to the team and comprising the team and plenty of lead time to get those people on board.
It's important, and again, I think, I mean, Gerald kind of talked about that, setting the stage. So it's important to let all members know what the commitment is. So being upfront and saying, you know, we're going to be together for 3 days or 4 days. This is the actual walkthrough. We're going to be making recommendations. Your input is really needed, and again, we talk about that invitation. So an invitation to reluctant parents has been a goal for some of the schools. In other words, really saying to someone, I need your input. We think what you have to say is important. It needs to be considered. That is the equity piece.
Great. So before we dive into looking at some of these specific questions, I just want to get back to this notion of the roots of this tool and the fact that it started as a bit as a customer service survey, and really what we're looking at now. So when we think about customer service, right, it's really one way. You have a problem or a question, something is done to you or for you to resolve it, right? You bought a pair of shoes, they don't fit, you need to return them, you want to exchange them. How do I get my money back? How does this happen? When we think about customer service in the business world, right, I'm sure that many of you can think about some companies that come to mind: Amazon, Zappos, LL Bean, Nordstrom's, right? Nordstrom's in particular. There's actually a story out there that's pretty interesting about Nordstrom's, and as the story goes, about 15 years ago, there was an individual that walked into Nordstrom's in Alaska to try and return snow tires. What can you imagine happened? Well, this individual put the snow tires on the counter and said, I would like my money back. As we know, Nordstrom's does not sell snow tires. The cashier saw that there was actually a price marked on the side of the snow tires, opened up the cash register, took the tires, and gave this man his money back. This is a pretty exceptional story, right? But it really highlights the fact that Nordstrom's set out in the 80s to be a leader in the area of customer service. And this is really something that they do exceptionally well. And I think those that have been to a Nordstrom's location, you can identify with this. And it's in part why you may be coming back to that store over and over again. But when you think about customer service, a store like Nordstrom's, they do more than just customer service, right? They're great at customer service, but it goes beyond that. Customer service is only one piece. Nordstrom's is also a leader in customer experience. Nordstrom's has given extreme thought to when a customer enters the store, to their shopping experience, and to when they leave, and every interaction in between. There's certain things at Nordstrom's that they do in particular. For example, when you check out, they will oftentimes walk the bag around the counter to you. That's purposeful. I don't know how many folks have maybe been at a Nordstrom's during closing time, but you'll find that Nordstrom's will never kick you out of the store if you are shopping. What I want to highlight by these examples, though, and sort of turn this back to thinking about schools, is that we need to think about this not from just a customer service angle, but we need to progress to customer experience. Because customer experience is more proactive and personal and purposeful, excuse me. It's relational, it's feelings oriented, right? We know that it's experience is in the eyes of the beholder, and that's what's most important, especially when we talk about how these teams are comprised and when we start to look at things through an equity lens. It's about how you as an individual feel about what's being done. It's an awareness of family strengths and the ability to anticipate their needs, not just something done to you or for you, right? This becomes two-way and shared. We're no longer just thinking about a single interaction or when parents just enter the building, right? It's, as we talked about, all of the interactions that we have with our families. And really what's most important as we talk about probably the debrief and next steps, schools need to consider thinking about their overall school culture and operating principles, and that this is no longer sort of one person thinking about one person interacting with families, but we need to make sure that there are common operating principles and shared values by all staff in terms of how interaction and how they interact with families. So here we have some questions, again, around the 4 components, and I just want to highlight some of them, right, as we start to think about looking at these through an equity lens. So again, while this tool is not specifically an equity tool, there are these questions that allow you to begin to have this conversation about equity within the larger context of family engagement. What is important to point out with some of these questions is that when we're asking these questions and team members are responding, that it's not a simple yes or no answer. We actually have a 1 through 4 rating scale, and that's really what's critically important because, again, it's based on individual perception. When team members are going out and observing and asking the principal these questions, we really strongly encourage team members not to discuss their scores until after they're done scoring, because we want them to score it based on how they're seeing it, and then again the discussion piece comes in afterwards.
So tell me, Gerald, depending on if you use this tool or another tool, one of the things that of course you'll look at in determining how welcoming your school is, you'll look at the physical environment. Why is that a piece of working on equity? How does the physical environment communicate whether some parents are welcomed and perhaps others are not so welcome?
It's a good question, Judy. So, you know, one thing that we look to immediately, and I think probably anybody can identify with this, right, is going into or accessing those schools where the signage may not be the greatest. And so one thing that we have to consider, right, is that is signage in different languages? Is it clearly posted? If you have somebody that, you know, may be handicapped and in a wheelchair, is it handicap accessible, just like it is for those that may not have a handicap? So, you know, these are just, you know, this is again one piece that we're looking at, but it impacts so many different populations, and again just starts to begin to allow us to have this conversation. So here are some great examples of the welcoming school staff, as well as website and written materials. You know, I think especially as Judy's question, you know, goes back to how can, you know, how do different areas impact different populations. As we think about website and written materials, this really gets to it. You know, specifically as educators, right, a lot of times the material that goes out to families is laden with educational jargon and acronyms, and sometimes you can't even get through it. So how would a parent that isn't speaking, you know, English as a second language, how would they perceive that letter? Would they even be able to read it at all? These are the things that we need to be mindful of and we need to consider. When there are publications sent home and resources sent out, do these resources, are they representative of your student population and families, right? This is critical that we begin to examine this and think about it.
So thank you, Gerald. I mean, these indicators that happen, and I have to tell you, more often than not, when people are even beginning to look at the indicators, and these are, you know, veteran, good staff in the school, they may say, I never even considered that indicator that you asked us about. So I think the other piece is that it really, you begin to understand that, again, I want to give credit to what's happening in Connecticut. We're doing some fine work in terms of family engagement. And in all schools that we go in, because I have an opportunity to go statewide and enter schools statewide, there's always a form of family engagement in the schools. Our challenge is to look at this, as Gerald talked about and Judy, is to look at this systemically. You know, it may happen in first grade, but does it happen in fifth grade? You know, that's the piece that I think that that's our growth piece in terms of using this particular tool. And then I'm just going to close before we're going to show a short DVD. But of course, I have a story. If you know me, Betsy Laborious, I always have a story. And so I'm just going to tell you quickly about a story. It's actually my story, and a colleague, and we had a meeting in the school, one of the schools. And on this particular morning, I was pretty well put together. You know, I had my briefcase, I had my stuff in my hand. You know, I looked the part, so to speak, as far as walking into the school. I went in. They immediately showed me the room that that the meeting was going to be held. I was given call. I mean, everything that could have gone well went well. My colleague that was coming with me for this meeting, on the other hand, did not have a great day. She has young children. It was difficult for her to leave on that particular day. A little bit not put together in terms of having things, and I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but just getting to the meeting was an incredible chore. So she finally got in. When I reached her, when she came into the meeting with me, I said to her, this was quite an experience. We have to note how welcoming the school is. And she looked at me and said, what are you talking about? Her experience was totally different. Her experience was totally different because guess what? She wasn't totally put together, and maybe she wasn't what the expectation was for her or what was happening. So that's one example. I mean, that was a very concrete example for me to say my experience was okay, but what are others' experience? Gerald talked about that perception, and perception really is, again, your reality in many cases. And so we have to be very cognizant of that fact. And how are there opportunities, again, to meet families where they are and to understand and discuss those perceptions. So I think what we're going to show you right now is a video. And then we'll, if you have any questions, please put them in. And This is and she's asking me to set up the video for you. So I will be the person who sets up the video. This is taped in Middletown at McDonough Elementary School. A principal and a secretary will talk a little bit about their experience in terms of welcoming schools. They actually were one of the first schools to conduct a welcoming walkthrough survey. Okay, so in terms, maybe not. Yeah, the video really points to again a parent's perception of what they perceived as welcoming, and again we just point to that relational piece, which is incredibly important. So Judy asked us to think about different tips in terms of, how would you get started? What would again, be the impetus for you to take a look at welcoming schools? So what I would say to you is that, again, this is kind of a self-reflection piece, and it might be one individual person, but what's it like to be new here? What would it, what does it mean when a person first enters, or a family first enters the school? That whole idea of giving your child over to school personnel. What do I need to know? What kind of assurances, or what kind of support do I need?
Betsy, I had an experience with going to a school. I was new. I'd never been to that school before. I was going there for a meeting. And it was a school that was must have been built in the 70s. It was this very modern school, had 5 or 6 sides. I walked the entire perimeter of the school trying to find the door, literally. And many sides looked like they could all be the front. So it was hard to be new to that school. And I was there in the evening, so I didn't have a lot of other people to follow to see exactly how to get into the school. So it can even be at the very beginning. Where do I park? How do I get in? And then once I get in the door, where do I go? And I know many schools now have security systems.
Yeah.
But it can also still be hard to see. If you're someone who's in that school every day, it can be hard to see it with fresh eyes. So how do you do that? If you're a person that's there every day, how do you take that perspective of what's it like to be new here?
So, the question are they glad to see you? That's interesting. So I'll take a step back from schools for a moment and share a little bit of a personal story. But just 2 days ago, my wife and I were visiting the pediatrician's office as we're expecting our first baby any day now. And knowing my wife obviously knows the work I do, and we were sitting in the pediatrician's office, and we look up at a sign right above the receptionist's desk, and it says two things. One was, if you're more than 10 minutes late, quote, don't bother, just reschedule. And the second bullet point was, if you drop off paperwork on the day of your appointment, you'll be charged $10. My wife immediately looked at me and said, "This is not very welcoming." So, I totally concur with her. And that's one of those things you have to think about. A lot of times, right, we're going in, and if you frequent this doctor's office over and over again, maybe you turn a blind eye to that. But as a first-time person in this office, right, that really stood out to me.
Good example. Good example. Almost new father. So I think that we've kind of we certainly have presented the information in terms of the relational and what it's like. And again, what I can say is that it's not the one thing that happens, but it's the multiple pieces put together that begin to kind of again examine different areas and different components of the school and the environment. So I don't know if there were any other questions, Judy. Did any other questions pop up for us to look at?
I don't believe there are any other questions. So we have some resources for people, and I believe everybody was just sent a link to the CREC website. There is a tool and there is training available from CREC. There are a number of tools out there that can help you take a look at how welcoming your school is. But let's just end with one other story, and it's a note of caution. When we first started this work, way back when, and we were looking for a tool, and the tool we began adapting, that's the tool being in use now, we came across a principal in one of our cities in Connecticut, and she said, "Oh, I know that tool. I also use that. I did it without telling my staff. Nobody knew what was happening. And I gathered people together and we held the walkthrough." And we said, "Well, that's a different model of doing it." And we said, "How did it go?" She said, "Terrible." The staff were not happy. The walkthrough didn't go well. And she was one of the biggest cheerleaders when we began this process to say, yes, all the things we talked about at the beginning, the training on how to do it, the transparency, the communication on getting everybody together on the same page to say, we're going to take a look at our school. Some people say, well, if you tell them that it's coming, then they'll just, people in the school might put on their best for that day. And we say, that's great, because then we see how good the school can be. And then it's our goal to be that good every day. And we'll see what our best is, and then we'll also see some areas, like we were saying before, that maybe we haven't noticed before. It's like when somebody's coming to your house and you suddenly look at your space with a different eye, and maybe you're gathering up all the mail that's laying around and putting it in a different room, which is what I have to do. So it's just taking a look at things that maybe as people who are there every day, we don't notice it quite as frequently. So there's resources on your screen. We have a couple of tip sheets and then also some of the research that we talked about earlier. I want to say one other word about the research. You're going to be seeing a guide with research in it coming out from the State Department of Education on a number of areas. This is part of the work we're required to do under ESSA. With the new rules for ESSA, we can only fund things that are evidence-based. So the Department of Education has produced guides in a number of areas, one of which is family engagement. And so that's going to be made available to districts very shortly. And you'll see that we're dedicated to high-impact practices, as we said at the beginning, and creating a welcoming environment for families is one of those high-impact practices. Want to let you know, in this series, we have 2 more sessions coming up. There's a May session and a June session. In May, we're going to talk more deeply about creating an environment that welcomes families, but from a different perspective. We're really going to go into those folks that are the face of our school. Very often the front office staff, folks in our protective services, and a number of other people that parents interact with. And we have some excellent examples from Danbury in how they have reframed what they're doing to welcome schools. And then in June, we have our final webinar of the series, where we're going to go then into linking to learning, another high impact practice. If you missed the first session that we mentioned at the top of the webinar, where Ann Henderson talked about the research, we have links to that. Those were sent to you with the announcement for this webinar. We can also make those links available after this.
So I see there's just one question around somebody looking to access the Spiral Bound book. So it is available. What I will do is send you my contact information. It is in the webinar, in the slides, but I'll also provide it in the answer here so that you have it. And if you contact me, we will make sure that we're able to get you a manual.
Great. And you do have our contact information, so if you have questions after this webinar, do feel free to let us know. I wanted to also mention that we have a monthly gathering of people who are interested in family engagement. We gather once a month on a Friday morning. We call it Friday Cafe, and Cafe is for community and family engagement. Our final meeting of the school year is going to take place on May 9th, and that's going to be at the Bushnell in Hartford. And if you haven't been to the Bushnell Theater before, it is gorgeous, and this is something not to be missed. Friday Cafe is free. We will have a short talk, and this one is going to be very celebratory. I'll tell you that much. And then there's a chance to network with other people who work in family engagement in many different ways. And then we are out of there by 10:30, so you can return to your day. But you will have met people from across the state that share this interest in family engagement. So please join us at Friday Cafe. If you want to get on the mailing list, so you'll be notified when we have next year's dates, please go to fridaycafe.org and jump on the mailing list, and then you'll be connected. Oh, did I give the wrong date? Well, it's...
I believe it's the 11th.
Okay. We may have, it's Friday in May. We may have just given you the wrong date, but we'll correct that. Jump on the mailing list and then we'll make sure you get the right date. Oh, I did. It's May 11th. Sorry, there's a typo there. May 11th in Hartford at the Bushnell. Thanks. And that's it. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.